The Red Scare of 1919 was a series of events that had the potential to alter the trajectory of the entire United States. And this requires a little bit of background into the philosophy of it to make sense. But in general, 36 package bombs were sent out to key U.S. figures, including congressmen, Supreme Court members, etc. Talk about this. Now, the Red Scare, for the most part, was perpetrated by anarchists. A lot of terminology in the leftist sphere requires very lengthy definitions. Often, the length of the definitions would lead one to believe that the ideas or philosophies run entirely parallel to each other. Sometimes these lines are so close, they require extreme magnification to see that they are not touching, so much so it calls it into question. If they are so close, does the differences really matter? Part of this is just leftist obfuscation. Sometimes the ideologies have such bad connotations to them that the left would rather pretend there are vast differences when there aren't. Alternately, many times it's similar to Christian denominationalism, where redefining a single word or trimming a beard is a whole new thing worth dying over. A quick breakdown on anarchism, socialism, and Marxist communism. These start in different places, at some point merge, and then diverge, but not always entirely. So, modern anarchism, and when I say modern, because all these ideas did have some like ancient roots where you can basically dig into Greek philosophy and say, hey, look, this guy had a similar idea, but they were never really practiced, and the economies of those periods were so simple that calling things socialism, communism, anarchism in those time periods is really pushing the envelope of believability. So when I say modern, I mean modern, and I don't really care about those earlier iterations. So modern anarchism has its roots from before the 1800s. It's a general idea that reaches back to an earlier age where an isolated farm villages were self-sustaining communal entities. Maybe there's property or it's possession of things by people using them. Sometimes there's a means of exchange and sometimes not. Modern socialism grew out of the problem of how to devolve the vast holdings of the French aristocracy and church. Socialism has many varieties. Does property exist? Does it not? In some cases, it does, it doesn't. Is property held in common or is it held personally? Is it held by the government on behalf of the people? These are the various variants of socialism. Are certain types of ownership allowed? Are exchange systems allowed? Is violence required to make it work initially? Now, Marx fused socialism and anarchism together. I'm not saying it was entirely his idea. I'm sure that they were going in that direction to start with. The Marxist prescription was that the first step in his system was that there would be a violent revolution or civil war with a high body count, thus ending the whole peaceful versus violence question. The second part of Marxism was that the workers or the proletariat would form the dictatorship of the proletariat. The mass of the worker class would spontaneously decide how to determine how property would be handled and how interim governing would occur. Third, they would transition to total socialism, socialism in everyday life, meaning social everything from the highest to the lowest, everything was somehow no longer an individual concern, but a collective concern. And ultimately, in the fourth stage, the government would melt away in favor of local communes, generally working together via uh, group decision rather than some hierarchical group above telling the two communes to function with each. So Marx ends the peaceful or violent question. He also ends the property question and the means of exchange question. and he gives both the socialists and anarchists what they want in separate stages. Of course, most socialists would be happy if progress stalled out at the third socialism stage. Now, the merger of socialists and anarchists are very short lived. At the first international meeting of communists, known as the First International, the anarchists, for the most part, break ranks because they came to the conclusion that they didn't see how it was possible that a fully socialist dictatorship with total power over a whole nation would ever willingly give up power to transition to the commune anarchy phase. And this will be one of the first of many groups that would break away from the Marxists to go their own paths once they saw that there is no path forward with Marx. Everything always ends at a brick wall. But that's a whole nother story. However, this then creates an intertwining of the terminology. Now, some anarchists remained Marxist, hoping that that fourth phase of Marxism could eventually play out. However, many, if not most anarchists, went off to create their own subgroups and philosophies of anarchy, more or less absent of Marxism. However, for most people, this initial alliance made Marxism, socialism, and anarchism pretty much synonymous in their minds. They were all one and the same as far as most people were concerned. Too much to detangle if you don't really care about it. Although many anarchists embraced Marxist like ideas of people's revolutions that would destroy governments, others looked towards alternatives. Now, as the 1800s went on, more and more revolutions sparked up across Europe, and pretty much they all failed. And some anarchists were active in organizing strikes and rural uprisings, and these never really seemed to go anywhere. They failed just as routinely as the major revolutions did. By the late 1800s, tactics began shifting. The violent anarchists decided that direct action violence was the remedy, since starting a strike, because they were organizing pretty vast and violent strikes that didn't go anywhere, rural revolutions that went nowhere. They got tied into actual countrywide revolutions that went nowhere. So, what they decided was that they were going to start doing bombings and targeted assassinations of leaders and establishment figures. The hope was that the violence might either destabilize a country or perhaps by showing the workers that even the highest leader was in reach, the workers might revolt once they realized how easy it was to get to elite targets. This triggered a wave of assassinations and bombings around the Western world in the late 1800s. For example, President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. Although some anarchists are peaceful and some merely theorize about revolution, these direct action activists made anarchist a definition to mean violence and chaos. World War One ended up causing upheaval among socialists and anarchists alike. Some remained anti war in the support of the workers. However, some became pro war, hoping that the social upheaval and wartime centralization might be beneficial to the cause. Now, the Red Scare bombers were spawned from Italian anarchists. US Italian immigrants were still fairly few in numbers and pretty much centered in East Coast cities. I believe at that time they were 3 to 4% of the entire US population. These Italian anarchists acted as agitators, organizers, and also doing independent violent action. A lot of these were doing these similar things back in Italy, and a lot of them actually had fled Europe essentially as wanted criminals and joined up with Italian communities in America. Uh, I might butcher this name a little bit, so pardon me. Followers of Luigi Gallegni were agitating due to poor factory working conditions and general issues with the Italians being a minority. The Gallieni followers would eventually perform their famous Red Scare mail bomb attacks, alternately known as the Mayday bomb attacks, as a protest against conscription uh, in the U.S. for the World War One. And then, of course, hoping that this would be a general attempt to agitate towards revolution. Oddly, the conscription thing wasn't as big of a issue by then because the war was already over. So, the Italian anarchists ended up sending out package bombs to 36 different prominent individuals. I'm going to mention mostly their offices, except where they're individuals who are of renown. Give you an idea how sweeping their target list was. So the 1919 Mayday bomb attacks, bombs were sent to the governor of Mississippi, the editor of the Daily News in Jackson, Mississippi, Postmaster General of the United States, the U.S. Representative from Alabama, the Commissioner General of Immigration, the Assistant District Attorney of San Francisco, the New York City Police Commissioner, Pennsylvania State Senator, District Attorney of San Francisco, a field agent for the Bureau of Investigation, which was a precursor to the FBI. In fact, these bombings would help create the FBI. The mayor of Seattle, the U.S. Senator from Georgia, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice, the Commissioner of Immigration of the Port of New York Authority, the Mayor of New York City, the U.S. Representative from Washington, the U.S. Senator from Utah, the Solicitor of the Post Office, the U.S. District Judge of Chicago, J.P. Morgan Jr., a famous businessman and banker, Special Assistant to the Attorney General, the U.S. Senator from North Carolina, the U.S. Attorney General John D. Rockefeller, famous rich businessman, Attorney General of Pennsylvania, the Mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, U.S. Senator from Utah, the Governor of Pennsylvania, the U.S. Secretary of Labor, and William Madison Wood, President of the American Woolen Company. Now, 36 bombs being sent through the mail, you might think, wow, this is probably going to be something that causes a big problem. But in fact, uh, only two of the bombs actually reached their target addresses. One did very marginal damage, one severely injured the housekeeper of one of the targets. Essentially, the design of the packaging of the bombs was made so that they had to be opened from one particular side to trigger the detonator in order to go off. One of the bombs was opened from the wrong side, causing the acid trigger to spill onto the table. The recipient reported it to the postal authorities. Once the post office was alert to the potential of a bombing campaign, the post office system found 16 of the packages uh, being held for insufficient postage. Anarchists of the world unite, huh? The anarchist mastermind had used identical and highly distinctive wrapping, which allowed for an additional 12 of the packages to be intercepted for delivery just on site alone. Had a good portion of these reached their targets, there's a very good chance history may have gone down another path, uh, potentially with more authoritarian crackdowns in the United States and probably a less warm, fuzzy feeling towards our red brethren in the Soviet Union once World War II rolled around. Now, as kind of an odd addendum, and because it actually occurs before 1919, but it kind of puts the whole anarchist thing into perspective to a certain extent. I want to talk briefly about Peter Kropotkin, a Russian anarchist. Uh, he pretty much stayed on the peaceful path, trying to set up little communes all over the place. And eventually, in old age, he would settle back into Russia right before the Russian Revolution kicks off. When he did get to Russia, so the revolution was in full swing maybe about a year after he got there. He thought the future was going to be absolutely bright for the anarchists. He looked at the pre-revolutionary organizations that were popping up. There were communes, the Soviets, which were impromptu councils running things. Soldiers and workers' councils were suddenly appearing all over Moscow and St. Petersburg. And he believed that this was going to be the basis of the commune system, the mutualist, the voluntarist interaction that would lead to a disintegration of government and a breakdown just down to these local units. However, once the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, his enthusiasm turns to bitter disappointment. Quote, "This buries the revolution. The Bolsheviks have shown how revolution is not to be made, that is, by authoritarian rather than libertarian methods." All right. Were you aware of the 1919 Red Scare and a bombing campaign of that year? Were you aware what an impact it had? It definitely did help cement anti-communist sentiment in the country, but I suspect if they had been more successful, it probably would have made things a lot worse. Probably not triggering a communist revolution, but in fact steeling people against communism in the future. What's your opinion on that? Would a successful bombing campaign of that nature have accomplished anything? Would it have changed events? What do you think? And also, any opinions on anarchy, uh, the various different stripes of it? And again, I think uh, my friend and I did some earlier videos on anarchy, which are a little bit more in depth. This was meant to be more of a broad brush rather than deep dive. All right, please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles. You'll see that there's all kinds of things we can get into. It's worth subscribing. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.